Hi, the topic I chose was the production of meat, specifically factory farms. Here at the beginning of my website, I have a little TED Talk clip where Wayne Pacelle, the president and CEO of the Humane Society, talks about the kind of abuse factory farm animals go through, and he basically brings a lot of awareness to the process of how they're killed, how their meat is handled, and a lot of the aspects of the really harsh abuse they go through. And then after that, I have a tab for the federal aspect. And this is basically talking about whether the food industry mistreats its animals. It is by Deborah Miller, who wrote a book called The Rights of Animals, called Does the Food Industry Mistreat Animals? And so it's a little excerpt. And basically, what she talks about is how there's a lot of legal acts like the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act and the 28-hour law, which have really changed the production of meat and how the animals are handled. And Deborah Miller really agrees with it, and she's grateful for a lot of these acts, but there's a lot of like loopholes that can be taken, and she thinks there's a lot more acts that should definitely be put in place in order to ensure that the animals their welfare is number one in the production of meat. And so she thinks that while there has been a lot of acts that have tried to like patch up these holes, they haven't been approached correctly, and they haven't been a lot of them haven't been passed. And then she also talks about an interesting aspect, which is basically that um, the whole thing she kind of thinks, in her opinion, is kind of hypocritical. The idea that like a lot of meat consumers, there's a lot of polls taken, and everyone's like, oh yes, you know, um, animals should be killed humanely, and that's the number one thing, but it it isn't shown because meat consumers demand the lowest price possible for their meat, at the same time arguing that all animals need to be killed in the most humane way. But it's kind of impossible to achieve that because in order to create the cheapest product, you have to produce it in the cheapest way. So she talks about that and how she thinks people need to consider that like when you're asking for things to be killed humanely, you have to also wonder that like, oh, that means there'd be higher prices, which is just one of the aspects of a more humane way of killing. And then this talks about the philosophy. So this is a book by Jonathan S. Foyer, and he talks about whether it's okay to eat animals at all. So even if animals are killed super humanely and everything is great, whether it's even okay to eat animals. And I really like this quote. He says, so Foyer explains how what we do as humans is we desensitize ourselves to the idea of killing animals and eating them for the pleasure of their taste. So he basically talks about how this topic is very philosophical in whether he basically just talks about if it's okay at all to eat meat. So I think that's cool. And then here's an interview with him. Pretty cool. And then here, this talks about the development of factory farming. It basically just says it's also by Deborah Miller, but it just talks about how as commercialization of the factory farms has bred, the quality of the animal's life has decreased. And so she talks about how the idea of cheap meat, like while the idea of cheap meat in abundance sounds super cool and super good, um, the author reminds us to take into the consideration that the treatment of animals and whether it's okay to consume the animal's meat after they've been exposed to a lot of harmful unnatural toxins, and how we basically expose ourselves to that when we consume them. And then this talks about the environment. So this basically just goes through about how factory farming is a big cause of the pollution on the earth, and how the negative effects it has on the ocean, and how like a lot of the commercial fishing methods are ruining the coral in the ocean. And so basically this article is trying to tell people that going vegan or being vegetarian would be really beneficial to the earth and the animals. So it just talks about how bad it is for the environment. Here's a pros and cons tab where I thought this was kind of interesting. But so Crystal Lombardo, who is the author, talks about how while there are cons to factory farming, people need to consider that factory farming has done a lot for the economy, and basically the entire industry has opened up a lot of jobs for, you know, the public. So she thinks that it's important to consider that it's done a lot of good for the economy. And then here's the visual. So this is like a little comic strip where the author or the illustrator shows here's a little cow. She's pregnant and she, produces milk all day. And then she gives so much milk that she can barely stand. And then when she's 7 years old and can't produce milk very well, she's sent to the slaughterhouse. And then a little twist of, irony, our friend the cow. And it's basically ironic because of how terribly we treat the animals, how we abuse them, how we basically, literally too, I guess, use them to every last drop, and we abuse them on a really emotional and physical level. So kind of messed up. And then how, we're like, oh, thanks, our friend the cow. How we treat our friends, basically. I mean, not how we treat, but showing how we treat our quote unquote friends very badly and mistreat them with a lot of abuse. And then here's my works cited, all my little bibliographies, and that's basically it, the production of meat.